Please welcome Amber Baldet, former blockchain program lead at JP Morgan.
Hello. Hi. How is everyone enjoying Ethereal thus far today? Yay! We've reached the end of the day at this point, so I hope everyone has had a great time. More tomorrow. So my name is Amber Baldet. Yes, until recently I was the program lead at JP Morgan for their blockchain program, but I am obviously not here in that capacity today. I'm simply here as a human at this point to talk to you a little bit about what I've learned in working with central banks and commercial banks and asset managers, but also startups and corporates and Fortune 100s and cypherpunks and information security professionals and maybe even some applied cryptographers about what's happening out here in this crazy blockchain space and where we might actually be going in creating something that looks like a pragmatic internet of value, or other words, something that actually functions. So, cool. First thing, there's no such thing as the blockchain, right? Now, the last time that I talked about this, I was at MIT and I was talking to a very business-focused group of people that might not actually know that there's not just a single blockchain. Now, of course, everyone in this room is well aware, and maybe you are more of a maximalist for one or the other. I think maybe we know where people's allegiances lie in this room. But you're at least aware that when someone says, put it on the blockchain, that that's essentially a meaningless question. So when I talk to people who are trying to build business use cases onto some sort of decentralized ledger, the first thing that they say, or there's always someone very smart in the room who will, it's kind of like the so what of enterprise blockchain, is to say, you know, well, does this need to be on the blockchain? And the first question should really be, well, which blockchain are you talking about? Because depending on what you're choosing and how it's architected and what kind of features it supports, you're really going to end up with a very different outcome. So just that basic kind of education. But there are actually lots of blockchains. You probably see some here that you recognize. And there's also a lot of distributed ledgers. Now, I got in a relatively heated discussion with Brian Bellendorf after the last time that I did this as to why some things were classified in different places. But I'm just going to say that at this point, the things that are classified as distributed ledgers are simply there because that's how they've marketed themselves to this point. And they see that as being a value proposition to them. So it's not specifically about how the Merkle hashes are happening like in their systems. Now, you see Quorum and Axoni and Parity and Photon up there. Those are all kind of enterprise derivatives of the EVM. And so, yes, they're more blockchainy in that sense. But they're not meant to be run in anonymously, usually. So they're meant for known actors. Anyway, moving on. That can get kind of hairy. The point is that they all are asking the same question. Anyone who's developing one of these platforms is confronted with needing to answer questions like, who is allowed to connect to this network? What kind of use cases are we here to support? What's the threat model? How would we upgrade or patch a bug? A lot of these sound like governance questions, right? How will we handle undesirable usage? So in an instance that someone publishes national security secrets to your blockchain, or revenge porn, or anything else, how do you handle that? And whether it's explicitly agreed as a community or not, every one of those ledgers and blockchains that you saw has an answer for that. Right? And so that's where a lot of the fundamental differences come in why enterprises and large corporates are being skeptical of what they can do in a public blockchain situation. It's not simply the scalability issue, although that matters. It's not simply the privacy issue, although that certainly matters. But it's also having one governance model for the mainnet. It can be very frightening, as opposed to, say, getting together with a consortium of collectively incentivized actors, wherein you know that if you need to, you can change the rules of the game without needing to, say, fight about it on Twitter for 2 years. So, choices matter. So when you're looking at these blockchain stacks from the ground up, essentially they all are answering questions by moving the levers on these different elements. At the bottom, you have something like an access model. Is it going to be public or permissioned? What's the data storage model? Is it really that kind of blockchain or a ledger or a directed acyclic graph or all these other kind of things that are coming out? How is consensus handled? And if you're moving away from some sort of proof of work mechanism, what are the implications to the trust and security model of the network? Above that are the first class features that really give each different blockchain its kind of personality, whether it is focused on privacy or whether it's focused on supporting smart contracts, et cetera. And then also above that, how you're handling actual application logic. So depending on how you mix and match these things, you get really different outcomes. So obviously, everyone here is going to know this one, right? So if you start with 21 million UTXO scarce tokens, right, and you use proof of work mining, then you end up with a peer-to-peer censorship-resistant system like Bitcoin. Fine. So if you were to take that same system, but now add zero-knowledge primitives and allow private transactions as well as the standard public ones, you have something that looks like Zcash, which is focused on fungibility of the tokens. If instead you were to go back to the beginning and say, well, we'll have a native currency, but that currency is also going to be used to pay for gas, we'll use that gas to pay for computations, and the computational power is really collectively coming to consensus about state mutations on a replicated system, well, now we have Ethereum, right? Everybody here knows that one. So if you were to take that Ethereum system and then fork the code, not the chain, just the code, and instead of running it as an anonymous system with world visible transactions, you are running it with known actors with confidential transactions, as well as having all those kind of micro networks that allow you flexible governance and ripping out proof of work, so you've got kind of faster performance, and putting in other algorithms. It looks a lot like Quorum, which is the version that we released at JP Morgan. And then finally, just for fun to compare, if you were to go back to that Bitcoin code base and then pull it in-house and really evolve it to the point that it's a completely different animal, but throw a functional programming sort of language on top of it that's really targeted explicitly at capital markets use cases, that's what digital asset is doing. Okay, long story short, what does it mean? It means that there's no one specific right answer. I previously had titled one version of this presentation Beyond Maximalism, but it seemed to make people really angry. So now it's just called Internet of Value. but by beyond maximalism, what I mean is that people have different problems, right? They're trying to solve the problems that they see in front of them. And just because you have solved your specific problem set doesn't mean that you've solved it for everyone else in the world. So it's perfectly acceptable to arrive at a different conclusion when you start with the same questions. And perhaps we could spend a little more time understanding people's different perspectives if we're trying to make these things work together collectively rather than simply win an internet argument. So there are important questions. And these are some of the questions that I like to spend time thinking about more. They have to do usually with privacy in the network, but not just privacy, but I think privacy is indicative of the power structure of the network, right? And so when you ask questions like, when the system works, who should see my data? Or if there's a breach, how compartmentalized is my data? With whom am I obligated to share my data? And how is that obligation enforced? As you start to think through the answers to that question, or those questions, then you start to understand that there's really a lot of power play dynamics happening within these networks, right? And if you can compel information from someone, that's one type of network. If you can censor their activity, that's of course another kind. But if you tell everyone, it's cool, bro, just everybody run a full node, that's potentially disenfranchising to people that don't have that capability. And as these systems evolve, we need to understand what we're doing to people that probably will never own a home computer. So there's very, very different kinds of architectures and systems that emerge out of these questions and how you answer them. So fundamentally, though, I think that strong encryption is a requirement of any of these systems. You probably think that all of our systems use strong encryption because it's complicated and there's a lot of math involved. But strong encryption has a very specific meaning. And it generally means that it's developed in the open and that it's gone through a collective process through various international standards bodies. And there are a variety of classes of encryption algorithms that are generally expected to be used in business and in applications, right? Now, in the United States, those are actually different than they are in places like Russia and places like China. And I remember getting, I see Vlad here. I think we were talking on Twitter a couple months ago, and best philosopher of our time, right, says the blockchain as international waters. And everyone's like, you're amazing. And I said, if by that you mean the public blockchain, fine, because I like to think of it that way, because what we're doing with the way that cryptographic standards are evolving in enterprise blockchains looks a lot like the crypto balkanization that we've seen over the last 30 years. Right? And it's called the crypto wars, and it's called Splinternet, and it's gone through started a long, long time ago, long before the blockchain. And we're going to see that all over again. I just came from speaking at Hack in the Box in Amsterdam a couple weeks ago, and was talking to people, like, they get it. They're really like information security people. They care a lot about national security and advanced persistent threats and whatnot. But there are certainly people who spend a lot of time thinking about the way that cryptography impacts geopolitics. And so, wouldn't you know it, last week there was an article in the New York Times that the FSB had shown up at an ISO meeting saying, we are going to own the blockchain, right? The FSB is the intelligence agency of Russia, in case you're not aware. So these things are definitely coming to pass, and it's important that we're paying attention to what's happening here. So on top of that strong encryption, though, you want to have something that looks like selective disclosure. Selective disclosure means that you are not forced to disclose these things, but rather that you opted in, there was some sort of consent here, to share that information. Now, you can enforce at an application layer that, for example, I must disclose this transaction to my regulator. But on the other hand, if you don't do that, maybe there's legal recourse where a regulator, or your legal entity will come and hunt you down for not disclosing to your regulator. But if you were to use that same exact system in an instance where there was not a regulator, then there's no other way to compel you, right? So, subtle difference. And now it's interesting if you start thinking about that power thing on top of selective disclosure. What happens when we start having different classes of metadata? Right? So how good is my name off of a birth certificate versus my name off a state ID? How can that disenfranchise people that perhaps are undocumented at this point? And when it becomes excessively easy to check people's credentials as we deploy these things, how do we ensure that we aren't having outcomes that we find to be generally abhorrent as a society, right? Something to think about going forward. Back to privacy. Okay, so there's a lot of different privacy solutions going on right now, and we're not going to have time to talk about all of them. But the fact is that there is no one bulletproof, despite the fact that one of them is literally called bulletproofs, there is no one bulletproof solution right now for on-chain cryptographic privacy. And we see a mixture of on- and off-chain solutions when we look at enterprise ledgers. So we're going to spend 1 second talking about the zero-knowledge proof side, simply because I've worked with the Zcash team a lot. We had taken some of their technology and put it into Quorum previously, into what was called the zero-knowledge settlement layer, much as kind of you would say, Bitcoin is to the blockchain. It was like Zcash is to the zero-knowledge settlement layer, not about the currency, just about the tech. But it's really fascinating. I'm sure everyone here is super excited about what ZK snarks are going to do for the world. But there's tons and tons of math, and it's super complicated, and we have no time to talk about any of that, so that's fine. But here's an example. Okay, so as a salary attestation, you could generate a zero-knowledge proof such that you could prove that your income was, say, over $80,000 or something, so that you could get a mortgage, or over X dollars, so you could get a car. But when you disclose to the checking entity, they don't actually need to know what that exact number was. So you could do this with birthdays, you could do this with salaries, you can do it with lots of stuff. You can do it with anything that's a number value. It's a specific type of proof, though. Now, what Zcash has been working on implementing are ZK snarks, and that's a more generalized sort of an application. So rather than simply looking at one specific type of information, you can create a circuit that will create an attestation about anything you can express as a polynomial, which is lots of things, it turns out. And so you could do something like, let's say, create a market where you could bid on CryptoKitties that had super cute eyes, but you wouldn't know what was going on with their ears or tails, right? So it would be like a grab bag, right? So obviously this has a lot of societal value. So you could imagine, though, that instead maybe these things are other kinds of financial assets or other marketplaces. It gets really interesting. And as we try to create decentralized exchanges, and as we try to create more privacy-preserving types of exchanges for everything, not just crypto tokens, I think they're going to be very useful. Right. OK, so we've got the tools. What might these networks actually look like in practice? Well, let's start with the bank. There's your bank. OK. So first off, they continue to have databases. It's amazing, right? Internal databases, shocking. Does that mean that decentralization has failed? Probably not. So you're going to have information that is internal to any sort of organization. Here I've chosen a bank. That's a good thing. At least until we've really solved on-chain privacy, you probably don't want to be putting a lot of data there. Instead, you want to be putting hashes that point to information held elsewhere, and those sorts of zero-knowledge attestations that you can reference. So what we're really doing is dumbing down what it is that you put on the blockchain, right? Maybe we need fewer smart contracts and more just dumb coordination. Right, so you got a lot of institutions. They all have that kind of infrastructure. Now we've added a couple regulators there in orange, and all the little gears, those are your smart contracts. So in an enterprise setting, what you're talking about is more like a mutualization of workflows. And what that means is that you're not all coming to consensus about this state machine in one go, right? There's generally some sort of point-to-point communication of information. In Quorum, that was called Constellation. In Fabric, that's called State Channels. Digital Asset and R3's Corda have different models, but they all kind of do the same thing. And what that is not share your business logic with everyone else on the network. And that's really a huge hurdle to getting businesses to use this stuff. So now with your regulators, you'll see that it's plural, and there's more than one. And that's because there's always more than one regulator, and also because they are only entitled to a specific subset of the information. So to go back to that strong encryption God keys thing, if you have a pilot and you say, well, the regulator here can see everything, that isn't really thinking through what the actual topology of the network is going to be in the future, and the fact that you probably, if you give a God key to a single regulator, then another regulator is going to come in right after that from some other place and say, well, they got it, why can't I get it? And now you no longer actually have a privacy-preserving system. So you go from talking about peer-to-peer networks to talking about business-to-business networks and trust models to talking about perhaps sovereign government to sovereign government trust models. And that's why decentralization does continue to be compelling. Like real blockchain decentralization can be compelling in these cross-jurisdictional areas where historically, it's not that we didn't have a centralized database where we could have stuck all this information in. It's that no one can agree on where that should sit and in whose jurisdiction that is, and what the legal recourse is, what the dispute resolution framework is for that. And so in this case, you can kind of stop saying, like, it's not so much trust but verify, it's don't trust, verify. And maybe in the future, with this kind of eroding social trust model that we have, maybe the only way that we will be able to work together is to simply absolve each other of that obligation to trust. I know it's probably not the rosy social good utopian thing of like we're building an internet of trust. I kind of think we're building an internet of mistrust. And like that's okay. I don't know, maybe I'm just Machiavellian. Okay, so finally you've got all this data on the network, and now you can pull back down that information to which you're actually entitled. Stick it into your Hadoop database or whatever, run your own kind of machine learning logic on it. You wouldn't want to do that on top of an actual blockchain network. It'd be super slow. And you can give your clients some insights. Fantastic. So you end up having people who still interface with you as a business through the client portal that they know and love. You are still in charge of releasing features to them. You are still in charge of some sort of sticky client relationship. All of those things make businesses happy. But you've actually gotten value out of coordinating information and workflows and data sharing with your partners. Now, this could also be like actual tokens of value. In the future, they're just not there yet. Okay, so same thing, but semi-public supply chains. I think that supply chains are going to become these kind of hubs that really tie everything together because you're crossing a physical supply chain with a financial supply chain. You might need to access information on a public network, but at the same time, you're going back and dealing with all these different like private business logic. There might be consumers in there somewhere. So supply chains are really kind of the heart of these networks. Permissioned and wholesale markets, I'll just skip through quickly. Open regulated retail markets. What I mean by this is almost like white markets. I don't mean to say that what happens on a public network is therefore illicit. What I mean is that if you're going to launch something that looks like Airbnb on the blockchain, you probably don't have an expectation of true anonymity. Right? Or if like Delta and American Airlines are trying to do these like point swapping pilots, they're not going to go put that on a public blockchain necessarily. So we'll have all these other kinds of networks that we can access where people will know who you are. That doesn't mean that you can't have other identities or alternate kind of ways to access other networks, but it means that you still might buy something from an e-commerce storefront that still says Amazon on it. Okay, and then public networks, so that's the blockchain, right? So what's on there? Well, you've got your peer-to-peer value transfer, which you expect. You've got identity attestations, hopefully not actual identity. Please stop putting identity systems on the blockchain. You've got crypto asset servicing, so when actual kind of financial institutions start playing around. You've got, you can pin state roots of permissioned networks. You can verify your Internet of Things code. You can have like censorship-resistant news or censorship-resistant fake news, all of that on the blockchain, great. Okay, so together that collectively looks like an actual Internet of Value. It's something where the information resides at the point at which it's most pragmatic, right? It's where we stop giving away our data necessarily, and by our, I don't just mean individuals, but businesses as well, to these kind of centralized data hubs, but where the information can stay at its point of origin, but needs to be able to be accessed in a very cogent sort of a way. Right? So that really has implications to how we handle things like machine learning. I don't think that this kind of stuff would happen without a fight, right? So it's all well and good to say that self-sovereign identity and monetizable data that I have in my secure enclave would solve the world's problems. But I think there's going to be very strong disincentives for the rest of the businesses who have a kind of, well, let's call it surveillance capitalism, business model to continue to operate that way. So unless we can create business models that allow alternatives to exist, you're either talking about like terrible sorts of revolution, or these things just kind of mess around the same way that the Tor network could have provided anonymous internet, but has never managed to do that at scale. Right. So when I work on this stuff, I like to think a little bit more pragmatically as much as I can, because there are plenty of idealist people in this room, so I'll just kind of sit in the middle and be the pragmatist, and try to figure out how we can stitch these together into something that can really be at least marginally useful for everyone. So what do you got? Strong encryption, hybrid networks on top of that, zero-knowledge attestations, as well as other privacy and selective disclosure. Ta-da. So why now? I think we see this kind of aligning of consumer sentiment, GDPR and regulatory pressure changing business incentives. The crypto genie is out of the bottle when it comes to geopolitical threats, and we have the technical capabilities. So we simply just didn't have cryptographically unique digital bearer assets previously. We didn't have practical applications of zero-knowledge proofs, so this really is new. And it's worth remembering that things do change. I know it sounds crazy, but if you look at the companies by market cap over the last 100 years, there aren't a whole lot of them that are still up there. And I guess you could ask Kodak how their physical photo printing business is doing, but I guess they sell mining rigs now or something. I don't know. So I don't know. Anyway, I'll be talking at Consensus on Monday. You should probably come if you're going to be there. I will be talking about exciting stuff like what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. So thank you. And I have about 3 minutes for questions if anyone would like to ask anything. Anything I am allowed to answer. Yes. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to say, please come to the mics. Yeah.
Are you able to speak any faster? Was it?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I go for density, not brevity. Anyone else? You have to just go up to the mic because I can't see hands in a room this big.
Hi, you're amazing. Thank you so much for the insights. How do you see the entertainment industry adapting to blockchain in any way?
Entertainment industry. That's a good question. I was around for the first DRM battles of trying to figure out how to watermark content. I think the idea of being able to micro-monetize and pay independent performers and other things is really interesting and hopefully will work out. On the other hand, I think it comes with the privacy concern of how does everybody really want, maybe you trust Spotify with your listening habits, but do you trust all of us with your listening habits? Maybe not. So one of the things that we trust centralized providers for right now is that kind of shield. And until we have the ability not just to pay performers in micropayments, but to pay them anonymously, that is, I don't know. I don't want to disclose everything I listen to on Spotify because some of it's embarrassing. Not that it's like, 90s pop or anything. Okay, that got awkward. Anyone else? Yes.
The last one. And you're talking about taking away ID systems from blockchain. Why?
Taking away ID systems. No, what I meant by saying not putting identity on the blockchain itself has also to do with why people are concerned about GDPR, meaning that we just won't be able to utilize blockchains at all. So we should assume that over any sort of sufficient time frame, up to and including the heat death of the universe, all crypto is crackable. And so it's, especially as we start looking at these kind of more globalized systems where there's an increased incentive to disclose what's on the network, putting PII literally on the blockchain is a very scary concept. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have self-sovereign identity systems. I think they're super great. Cool.
Now that we know,
yeah.
Bitcoin is not a fraud, what are you going to do with the rest of your life?
You have to come to consensus on Monday and find out. Cool. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you